Hi, I'm Zoe Drew and I'm going to talk to you about HSE Enforcement Activity over the last year. So we're going to talk about prosecutions, enforcement notices and examples of convictions. First up then, the numbers of criminal prosecutions. Now you can see from the chart here that these numbers have gone down significantly over recent years. So this isn't all about COVID. There's a significant backlog in the criminal courts before the pandemic even struck us. So looking at this chart, you can see the numbers on the left refer to the cases that are actually brought to the courts, and the numbers on the right are those cases which resulted in a successful conviction. So the HSE have a 93% success rate when they actually take a case to court. In terms of fines issued as sentences for these cases, there's a total of £26.9 million in fines issued to duty holders found guilty over the last year or so. That's down quite a lot from the year before, but we had far fewer cases. The average fine for these cases, £145,000, which has of course gone up. So we have fewer cases, but we have higher fines per case. In terms of the potential outcomes from a conviction, the sentencing choices that are really available to the courts, they look a little bit like this. So that a criminal fine, is the most likely outcome in a sentence. But we also see a fifth of cases resulting in a custodial sentence, which would be a suspended sentence most of the time. We also get community service orders going into that bracket. But 2% of cases actually resulted in people immediately going to jail. And there have been a lot of cases, so that's still a significant number of people who have had an immediate custodial sentence as a result of a criminal conviction. Okay, in terms of recent prosecution examples, there have been hundreds, so I just picked out a few for you here. There was in the transport and haulage sector, a £200,000 fine there for a breach of Section 2.1 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. So this is the general duty of employers to ensure the safety, health and welfare of their employees. In the construction sector, some unsafe excavation work there, a 16-week suspended jail sentence, 200 hours of community service. In manufacturing, another £200,000 fine there for a second breach of Section 2.1. So again, duties of employers to their employees. And then finally here, a 3-metre fall for a roofing company there, resulting in that far smaller fine. Now, in terms of the scope of the fines here, there are reasons behind this, okay? So when sentencing, there are some guidelines. And the things that need to be looked at when the sentence is given are the harm or the potential harm. So what actually happened or could have happened as a result of the breach. Then you've got the culpability. So how guilty was the company, if you like? Was the incident a one-off event in an otherwise unblemished record, in which case it would reduce the fine? Or is this an organisation where they've been lucky not to have an accident up until now, to be honest with you? Perhaps they've ignored a lot of warnings, even been in breach of previous prohibition and improvement notices. That's going to really build the fine up. Then lastly, you've got the size of the organisation. So if you've got a huge turnover organisation, they're going to be in a far higher bracket for the fines that might be issued. And conversely, if it's a smaller organisation, they're going to be smaller. But this is real money. So none of these criminal fines are covered by any kind of insurance policy at all. Real money out of the bank account. So they're always going to be significant. We've had a few significant corporate manslaughter cases this year. Now, since the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act came into force in 2008, there have only actually been 40 cases in total, 30 of which resulted in a conviction, and all of those 30, the defendant pleaded guilty. So for this last year then, we've had Alutrade, a £2 million fine there. This is a recycling centre. Astor Healthcare, just over £1 million fine there for the death of a dementia patient who suffered severe burns in a scalding hot bath. Absolutely tragic story. They're all tragic by their nature, of course. And very recently we had Decopac, who were a wholesale garden supplies company. We don't have a sentence for that yet because we're still awaiting the sentencing, but there's been a guilty plea there as a result of a crushing injury. Finally, it's worth noting this one, the case of Bosley Mill. Now, this was a big explosion. 4 people were killed on the day in this particular event. But because of the nature of corporate manslaughter, there was not actually a case to answer. There were convictions under the Health and Safety at Work Act, but not for corporate manslaughter. Now, this is why it's so difficult to get a meaningful conviction and why the conviction rate is so much lower. So for a successful prosecution for corporate manslaughter, this is what the criteria that need to be met. Okay. First of all, the defendant needs to owe a duty of care to the victim. For example, they would be their employer. It's a fairly straightforward one there. There needs to be a gross breach of that duty of care, not a simple breach, but a gross breach. Okay, so something needs to have been done very, very badly, incredibly poor decision making, and so on. That breach needs to have had a direct causal link to the person's death. And then finally, the business of corporate manslaughter is that it's about culture and training and leadership. It's about the way the organisation is run that's resulted in the breach which has caused somebody's death. So you can imagine in a criminal court situation to prove that beyond reasonable doubt is quite challenging. Hence the fact that only 30 successful convictions have come about since 2008. Okay, in terms of enforcement notices then, so these would be improvement notices and prohibition notices. These are the far more common, really, enforcement that the HSE deliver, and they can issue as many of these notices in a day as they choose. You can see a significant drop-off because of COVID, not only because of shortages in the HSE because of the pandemic, but because of the workplaces they would tend to visit. Many of them were simply closed because of the lockdowns, all right? But nevertheless, still the HSE were busy issuing enforcement notices, and they also issued a number of these notices for COVID breaches themselves. So it'll be interesting to see next year whether those numbers go back up to what you might consider to be normal. If you'd like more information about any kind of enforcement activity, there is an online database that the HSE have available on their website, publicly accessible to everybody. You can search for this by breach of legislation, by area, and you can even search for it by company name of the defendant. Okay, so if you're looking for more detail, more information on that, it is available online. Hope that was useful for you. Thank you very much for listening.